Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us. We're here to present our focus and priorities of the new National Security Strategy, titled Canada Resilient, United, and Secure, short for CRUISE. My name is Melissa Panza, and I'm speaking to you on behalf of the Privy Council Task Force. I'm joined by my colleagues Cassandra Campbell, Yama Masood, Maria Gartman, and Zina Hamoud. We would also like to acknowledge that we are presenting from the unceded and traditional Coast Salish lands, including the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam nations. We thank them for the hospitality. Next slide, please. Content. I will be giving an introduction and brief overview of our tasks. Then we'll go into the priority methodology selection, ranking score results, and policy evaluation methodology. This will explain how we determined our 3 priorities. Yama will discuss our first identified national security focus of American hypernationalism and Trumpism. The identified problem is Canada's overdependence on the US military and recommendation civilian defense corps. Maria will discuss our second identified national security focus of mercantilism and economic security. The identified problem as Canada relies on the US markets and recommendation to negotiate the Canada Free Trade Agreement to increase interprovincial trade. Cassandra will discuss our third identified national security focus of the great power rivalry, Russia and China. Identified problem of Russia and China destabilizing Canada and our policy recommendation of NATO and intelligence sharing. Next slide, please. Introduction. We were assigned the task of analyzing 14 national security risks and determining 3 to 4 priorities that are the most acute and urgent over the next 4 years. We were asked to provide an explanation for the choices, propose policy interventions, provide implementation, magnitude of costs, and challenges. To determine the core priorities of CRUISE, we used a combination of matrices from the UNDP, Public Safety of Canada, Treasury Board of Canada, and United Kingdom National Risks Registry. We used 9 criteria, measures, and ranked each category on a scale of 1 low to 5 high. Further details are in the risk matrix are in the Appendix 2. To assess each security risk, we conducted expert interviews, analyzed the literature and government reports to determine which would pose the most acute and urgent national security risk to Canadians. Our results showed 3 national security risks that ranked the highest. The top score was American hypernationalism and Trumpism with 36 points, mercantilism and economic security with 32 points, and the great power rivalry, Russia-China with 30 points. The results will be shown on the next slide. Next slide, please. In this table, the 3 top scores are shown in red. The national security risks shown at the show that the end of the post-war rules-based international liberal order. The old order has been replaced by an era of great power politics in which China, Russia, and the United States are weaponizing their military and economy to expand their spheres of influence. As a middle power, Canada benefited from the rules-based international liberal order, and now Canada's economic, political, and territorial security are at risk. A full breakdown of the risk matrix is in Appendix 1. Next slide, please. To assess our policy options, we used a multi-criteria evaluation with the categories of effectiveness, cost, administrative feasibility, political acceptability, and equity. Effectiveness is defined as the extent to which the policy reduces the national security risk, with a scale of 1 meaning not effective and 5 eliminates the problem. Cost as the total resources required to implement, with 1 meaning not cost effective to 5 costs nothing. Administrative feasibility is the extent to which government can implement the policy, with 1 meaning not feasible to 5 no administrative challenges. Political acceptability is the degree to which the public would support the intervention, with 1 meaning not politically acceptable to 5 public would fully embrace the policy. Equity is the extent that the policy intervention impacts different groups, such as Indigenous people and GBA+, with 1 not equitable and 5 completely equitable. In the next sections, the teams will elaborate on the 3 national security risks. They will provide an overview, the 3 policy options for each, the scoring, recommended policy intervention, implementation, magnitude of costs, and challenges. I will now pass it over to Yama, who will elaborate on our first focus, American hypernationalism. Next slide, please.
Thank you, Melissa. Canada's autonomy is undermined by its overdependence on its military partnership with the United States, particularly during periods of American hypernationalism. To paraphrase Prime Minister Carney, Canada's military integration has become the source of its subordination to US interests. For example, earlier this year, Canada's hesitance to buy F-35s from the US led to a threat that the US would alter North American Air Defense Command, also known as NORAD. Canada's current strategy aims to improve Canada's military capacity and reduce dependence on the US by investing in the growth of a domestic defense industry. Some alternative policies to achieve Canada's goals are as follows. The first option is a trade treaty for defense armaments with other Pacific countries, reducing dependence on procurement from the US. The second option is a 10,000-person civilian defense corps pilot program that will respond to emergencies and natural disasters. Finally, the last option, a pro-Canada public relations campaign, will persuade the American public that Canada is a trustworthy and worthwhile military ally. Next slide, please. The government's current approach may reduce dependence on procuring arms from the US. However, it does not change Canada's dependence on being part of NORAD and the Five Eyes. Moreover, the current strategy does not address the armed forces' current lack of capacity due to shortfalls in recruitment and retention, as well as the force's preoccupation with emergency and disaster response through Operation Lentus. This lack of capacity and staffing means that increased domestic arms production will have limited impact on military capacity. We recommend an additional policy, the creation of a voluntary paid civilian defense corps. The corps will improve the Canadian Armed Forces capacity for military missions by freeing the armed forces from their responsibility for disaster response. And by providing 10,000 Canadians with basic training, the Civil Defense Corps may act as a funnel of qualified individuals into the armed forces or reserves. Multiple European countries, including Sweden, have successfully reintroduced civilian defense programs to bolster their military capabilities in the face of threats from Russia. This policy has the added benefit of removing one of the Trump administration's pretexts for threatening to discontinue our military partnerships. The Trump administration has labeled Canada a military free rider for not meeting its NATO spending requirements. The spending on the Civil Defense Corps will count towards Canada's military spending. Finally, the Corps will make Canada a harder target, heightening the costs for any foreign aggression. Next slide, please. Significant interdepartmental coordination between national defense, public safety, and employment and social development is required to implement the policy. There will also be a need to establish new legislation. Federal and provincial cooperation may be necessary to reach and engage potential recruits. Costs will be low in comparison to the overall 2026 military budget. Some of the public may perceive the program to be mainly a military one, so communications will emphasize that it is primarily a civilian program geared towards national service. Public opinion research in Canada suggests strong support for national service, especially in regard to emergency and disaster response. The policy has the added benefit of strengthening social trust at a time when polarization is visible, for example, in movements like the trucker convoy. A highly visible service corps across the country will reinforce shared Canadian identity and values and counter foreign efforts to destabilize Canada. Furthermore, equity gains will be significant. Positions will provide a living wage and expand access to credentials. This attractive employment opportunity will prioritize equity-deserving groups, including Indigenous, Northern, and rural populations. And with that, I will pass it on to Maria.
Thank you, Yama. Our second national issue is mercantilism. Next slide, please. Our second national issue is mercantilism and economic security. The issue is that Canada relies on free trade, but protectionist measures from the US and mercantilism directly threaten Canada's GDP. In 2025, the United States imposed a 25% tariff on aluminum, auto, and steel, and a 10% tariff on energy. Because exports account for roughly 1/3 of Canada's GDP and the US is our largest trading partner, these tariffs strike at the core of our economy. Under CUSMA, 99% of goods are tariff-free, but this is currently under review. Tariffs raise production costs, increase consumer prices, and reduce exports. The problem is that if Canada loses access to United States markets, a recession is likely, according to the governor of the Bank of Canada. This would pose a national security problem. Economic downturns reduce government revenues, constrain defense, as well as diplomatic capacity. Economic vulnerability creates openings for external leverage as well. So, what can Canada do? Here are the options. The first is to renegotiate the Canada Free Trade Agreement 2017, which will reduce intra-provincial trade barriers even further. In some sectors, internal trade costs are equivalent to a 21% tariff. Thus, provinces should adopt mutual recognition agreements so that professional licenses and technical certifications are recognized nationwide. This can also harmonize key standards and remove the buy local procurement restrictions. As a result, it would create a buffer against external trade shocks. The second option is to lower quotas as well as reduce tariffs with non-US partners, such as Japan and South Korea. These are advanced, politically stable trade partners. Moreover, they depend on resources that Canada can provide. Expanding trade with them will reduce our over-reliance on one single market. The third option is to secure critical mineral agreements with the United States and Mexico, modeling the Softwood Lumber Accord. The trade of these minerals is essential to Canada and broadly Western defense capabilities, as well as energy technologies. Thus, Canada should ensure that these critical supply chains are insulated from tariff disputes, either within CUSMA or through parallel agreements. Next slide, please. In the evaluation, interprovincial reform is the strongest primary policy. It directly increases domestic GDP, reduces reliance on the United States, and requires mostly regulatory changes. Moreover, domestic reform is more administratively feasible since it is not dependent on negotiations with outside political actors. It also improves equity by enhancing labor mobility. Next slide, please. In terms of implementation, the Canadian Free Trade Agreement already exists. It simply needs stronger enforcement and an expanded scope. A realistic timeline is 2 to 5 years, and estimated costs would range between 200 to 500 million, and it will be funded through federal budget reallocation through Innovation, Science, and Economic Development Canada as part of an economic resilience strategy. A possible challenge would be coordination among all of the provinces and territories, but this strategy represents very high gains, given that interprovincial trade barriers reduce Canada's GDP by 4%, and even a 1% increase would raise our GDP by $25 billion. The authority of this strategy would be an ad hoc committee formed in cabinet composed of federal and provincial ministers. In terms of communication, the challenge is that provinces may worry about losing provincial autonomy. However, we have allocated a significant amount in our budget to alleviate such losses. The bottom line is that economic integration builds resilience, and resilience at home is foundation of CRUISE. Thank you. Next slide, please.
Thank you, Maria. I will now discuss our third strategic priority, which is the third element of CRUISE, secure. Russia and China are acting in a way that destabilizes Canada's security, both domestic and economic. These behaviors reflect a broader environment of geopolitical tensions, economic decoupling, and fragmented global institutions. Russia and China present different but simultaneous threats to Canada. First, the main threat that Russia poses is Arctic security. NORAD has reported a 300% increase in Russian marine military activity in the Arctic between 2024 and 2025. This increase in military activity challenges Canada's sovereignty, especially with respect to the Northwest Passage. Current policies in place in the short term are the NATO Arctic Sentry that was recently deployed a couple weeks ago that focuses on surveillance and deterrence. And in the long term, the Prime Minister has announced an industrial defense strategy to rebuild the Canadian Armed Forces and procurement. China poses two primary threats. First, transnational repression, which is defined as foreign interference, cyber attacks, and surveillance. China is the #1 perpetrator of foreign interference and cyber attacks in Canada. The second threat that China poses is militarization in the Indo-Pacific. This is important for two reasons. First, China is Canada's second largest trading partner. Second, by 2040, 50% of global trade will pass through the Indo-Pacific. In the event of a geopolitical conflict, this would seriously impact Canada's economic security. The most likely scenario is that the Chinese would advance in Taiwan, which would most certainly trigger a US response. Current policies in place are the G7 Rapid Response Mechanism to respond to foreign interference and the Indo-Pacific Strategy. There's 3 options to target these threats. First, we could engage in a new free trade deal with China and improve diplomatic relations through diplomatic missions. Expert interviews has highlighted Canada must spend more time to understand China culturally and politically. We also could increase our economic integration. By doing these 2 things, we might gain preferential treatment from China, which would achieve 2 objectives. First, it would secure our position in the Indo-Pacific, and second, because China and Russia are close allies and China does do research missions in the Arctic, this may deter Russia from advancing in the Arctic. The second option is we can increase military cooperation with NATO and build an intelligence sharing alliance in the Indo-Pacific. This would expand surveillance in the Arctic and act as a deterrence mechanism and expand our awareness of militarization operations in the Indo-Pacific, similar to the already existing Five Eyes. Option 3 is we could incentivize Canadian firms to obtain a secure by default cybersecurity software, otherwise known as two-factor authentication. This would improve defense against Chinese cyber attacks and surveillance and protect Canada's critical infrastructure. Next slide, please. Using our multi-criteria evaluation tool, it has become clear that the recommended option is to increase NATO Arctic operations and establish an Indo-Pacific intelligence sharing alliance. This mitigates the risk of domestic destabilization in the Arctic and economic destabilization in the Indo-Pacific. There's also opportunities to collaborate with the Inuit in the north as we increase military operations in the Arctic. Next slide, please. To implement the recommended policy, we suggest establishing an Arctic task force with the Canadian Coast Guard and Department of National Defense in collaboration with NATO to focuses on our strength, which is our naval fleet, and areas where we need support, such as air support. For the Indo-Pacific Alliance, we suggest Global Affairs Canada appoints a CSIS delegate to regularly coordinate with democratic partners in the Indo-Pacific, such as Japan, Korea, Australia, and New Zealand. Challenges we foresee are reorientating departmental resources to the Arctic and securing buy-in from Indo-Pacific partners. The cost that we foresee is $324 million for the Indo-Pacific Intelligence Sharing Alliance and $524 million for the Arctic Task Force. The budgets are earmarked in Chapter 4 of Budget 2025 for national defense. Communication challenges we foresee is avoiding fear-based and alarmist rhetoric concerning militarization in both the Arctic and Indo-Pacific, but we would emphasize a message of stability, preparedness, and alliance building and frame our actions as proactive rather than escalatory. Next slide, please. Today, we presented and proposed a national security strategy titled CRUISE, Canada, Resilient, United, and Secure. We outlined how multiple established risk assessment matrices were used to identify key priorities. Our assessment resulted in Trumpism, trade, and Russia and China being the most significant security threats to Canada in the next 4 years. For each priority area, we provided a set of policy options, clear recommendations supported by a multi-criteria evaluation tool. We walked you through our implementation next steps, including approximate costs and potential communication challenges. We hope this national security strategy ensures Canada's short and long-term future is resilient, united, and secure. Thank you for your time, and we look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much. It's obvious to work here, and it's very interesting the methodologies you used, and you were quite transparent in what those are. It's really wonderful to see you work together and collaborate as a team so effectively. I mentioned to the UBC team, I was at a bunch of universities this week actually, and you guys they were golfing not far from SFU, so I'm very jealous sitting here and in a winter wonderland. I'm going to ask Violetta to be our first questioner. Violetta is our expert on strategy and implementation operations.
Yes, hello everyone. Thank you for your presentation, very evidence-based, based on your methodologies and what you've shown. Related to operations and implementing the strategy, I wanted to ask you, there is always a need to balance between strengthening capabilities over time, right? While being prepared to respond immediately. And in this case, we would need to be prepared. So how does your strategy balance these competing priorities? That's my question.
Yeah, that you highlight a very excellent question. Did you, just to clarify, sorry, did you mean all of our policy options, or did you have a specific one in mind?
Yeah, so think about the roadmap for all of your options, like thinking through the streams of interventions that you described. And you have a number of actions over a period of time, and how do you balance the long-term goals and achieving them versus what should be done immediately in response to any threat? How do you balance that tension?
Thank you for the question. I think I can help answer it. The main time period that we were looking at was the 4-year time period. So that's really what decided our balance between short and long term. So you could say that our focus was more on the short term, the 4-year period. And the reason for that is because we felt that in the long term, we could apply more policies later, but this 4-year period, especially with regard to great power rivalry, that is what we were interested in most. I hope that answers your question.
Sorry, I just wanted to add on top of that, with that being said, things like removing interprovincial trade barriers and making our economy stronger, that is a long-term seed. So we focused on removing, or rather mitigating, the short-term threats and planting that seed for long-term security and stability.
That's great. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Violetta. I'm going to pass it over to my colleague, Vincent Rigby, who has expertise both in foreign policy and issues in the Arctic.
Thanks very much, Noah. And thank you for the presentation. I love the way you set it up at the beginning in terms of responding to the actual task and what you had to do and laying it out, and the methodology and the risk assessment, et cetera, and the evaluation. I really found that very informative. A couple of very, very specific questions, just so you can maybe break out the specific recommendations and how they respond to the threat. The Civil Defense Corps, which I think is a great idea, and a pilot program training 10,000 non-military disaster response recruits and providing them basic training. Can you unpack in a little bit more detail how that actually relates to American hypernationalism and Trumpism? What's the direct link between us providing or establishing a Civil Defense Corps as a response to American hypernationalism? I mean, I see an indirect impact, but I don't see a direct impact. And then the same on the Indo-Pacific region, where you're talking about Russia and China. You talk about intelligence sharing. And can you break that out a little bit? Because you say at one point, getting CSIS more involved in the Indo-Pacific. CSIS is already pretty involved in the Indo-Pacific and has looked at strengthening intelligence relationships with Japan in particular. So what's the value added there? And what exactly are you looking for? I think we should have more intelligence in the Indo-Pacific region in response to China's aggressive actions, but I'm not sure that we're not doing that to a certain extent already. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. I guess I will go first. So with respect to American hypernationalism and Trumpism, I agree that the Civil Defense Corps has more indirect than direct impact. The direct impact of the Defense Corps would be to harden Canada, basically make it a harder target. So we cannot, in the short term anyways, match American military capacity. However, if the worst case scenario were to come up with an American invasion, Canada's best bet would be something like guerrilla warfare. The Canadian military is already running these types of exercises. A civil defense corps or tens of thousands of Canadians with basic training would make this strategy more viable. So that would be the direct impact. I hope that answers your question.
Okay.
And I will jump in to speak on the Indo-Pacific. And with respect to the intelligence sharing group, the thought behind that was the understanding and accepting that we are in a new era of strategic competition where it would be in middle powers country interest to collaborate more effectively and have a more coordinated response, similarly to what Five Eyes ended up being post World War II. So as you mentioned, Canada is collaborating with Japan, but moving into a more collaborative, coordinated response with our Indo-Pacific partners to be able to act more coordinated as a group, as middle powers.
Thank you.
I'm going to probably take the last question, depending on how long you take to answer this. I would, on your number 2, which is the interprovincial the choice you made was to improve Canadian Free Trade Agreement. And could you explain how it's different now than it is in 2017? Could you explain there is still incredible resistance in the Maritimes with Newfoundland and intractable resistance in Quebec? What do you do differently now that hasn't been done over the last 20 years to do something in that area?
Yes, thank you so much. Very good question. The political climate is very different now, whereas in 2017, the US was a stable, reliant partner. Now things are changing. 77% of our exports are going to the United States. And with that becoming more difficult, we need to pivot. And doing that, one way of doing that would be interprovincial trade barriers. And how this would be different, my focus primarily would be on professions. Right now, for instance, a dental hygienist from BC cannot practice just a few hours away over the border in Alberta. And that creates significant labor mobility challenges. And it does affect our GDP by 4%. That is quite significant. And even though some provinces are resistant, we're allocating a huge portion of our budget to compensate those losses. And that budget can be a standing allocation, so yearly or quarterly, because we do expect this policy to increase revenue from businesses and thus increase taxation and government funds. So we would have the ability to, on an ongoing basis, reimburse the losing provinces.
Would you be reimbursing the losing provinces or the losing people?
The idea is to, in negotiations, in initial conversations, to figure out which provinces are most resistant to this policy, and to be able to come up with a sort of a quid pro quo agreement, a payment in exchange for agreement to reduce interprovincial standards and regulations.
Okay, well, thank you very, very much. Do the panel have any quick questions? We have about 50 seconds left.
So hearing none, we are going to say a huge thank you to SFU for their presentation.